Tiny in All That Air, the Philip Larkin Society podcast.
Hello and welcome to Tiny in All That Air, the Philip Larkin Society podcast. My name is Lynn Lockwood and I'm a trustee of the Philip Larkin Society. And the aim of this podcast is just to tell the story of Philip Larkin with as many different guests as we can find that have their own unique relationship with Philip Larkin. Today we had the second part of our conversation with Professor James Booth, author of the Philip Larkin biography, Philip Larkin Life, Art and Love, and also the editor of Philip Larkin's Letters Home to his mother and Trouble at Willow Gables, which is Philip Larkin's schoolgirls' writing. Today, James talked to us about Philip Larkin's development as a writer and takes a closer look at Philip Larkin's late poem, The Old Fools. We join James as he reflects upon Philip Larkin's long-term partner, Monica Jones.
If you look at the early stuff, which is what, when you asked me about the podcast, I said I thought some of the early poems are really interesting in an odd way. Yeah. I think when he met her, which was in the late 40s, he was very much on the left in those days in all kinds of different ways. And they had arguments about left-wing poetry and right-wing poetry. And he said, I don't know any right-wing poet who's any good. Yeah. And all the poets are left-wing, so that must tell me something. And, you don't only get little echoes of this because as time went on, he just toned down. But one of the arguments they had, I think, was about racism, because I think she was anti-Semitic. And I don't know for certain, but I think when the papers are opened up and you can see them, particularly the correspondence with her and also Montgomery, who knew them both at that time, you'll find out more about this. But he wrote one of the unfinished novels based on a woman called Augusta, who's obviously Monica. Right. If he'd have finished it, it would have been a fascinating comparison with Lucky Jim. Because Amos, as soon as he finds out that the Monica character in Lucky Jim has set up a suicide attempt, which is an attempted suicide attempt. In other words, she's fixed up people to come and visit her and then she takes an overdose before they come, so she knows she's going to be rescued, which is exactly what Sylvia Plath did, but she wasn't rescued. She knew that the milkman was going to come. She knew that someone, but it was too cold and everything, and all of a sudden, when she put her head in the gas oven, it did actually kill her. She didn't mean to do it. Larkin, of course, saw all the subtleties of that. Amos never saw it. He just thought, oh, this woman is just... and he just loses interest in her and writes a kind of a caricature of her. And Larkin just puts up with it. And he even gives him some lines. He just insists that he slightly changes the name to make it a little bit less like Monica's actual name. Only a little bit less, though. Can't quite understand what's going on there. There's a loyalty to Amos as well, of course. Absolutely, but Amos was so imperceptive and so thick when it came to relationships and subtleties. And Larkin was so subtle and so good at not good at relationships, but so intricated in his relationships that obviously that made Monica more interesting to him when she showed that kind of temperament. But part of the temperament was a rather abrupt and brusque anti-Semitism that she got from her family, I think.
And that's just family background.
When he wrote the Augusta Fragments, he called it a New World Symphony. One of the titles he thought for it was a New World Symphony. No one reads these now. They're in my Trouble at Willow Gables volume, and they're very interesting and very good, and a fascinating comparison with Lucky Jim. I wish he'd finished it and published it, found some minor publisher to publish it, because it would be better, a lot better than Lucky Jim. It wouldn't be so funny, and it wouldn't perhaps have made the headlines like Lucky Jim did, because of just where and when it was. And Larkin knew that it was said, in a letter to Monica, I think, that it's rather thin and undeveloped, but it's very funny. And, he had to give Amos his due, which is true. But his own version is profound and interesting. And I read it. If you ever read them, you'll see this, I think. The New World was America. And at the end, the young woman lecturer is going to lose her job in what's obviously Leicester University, where Monica was. And she was going to get rescued by going off as the governess or whatever, teacher of a young girl who belonged to the extended family of what is obviously a Jewish refugee in the novel. I've forgotten the name, but anyway. And this is going to be a new world that she's going to go to. He never finished it. Yeah. So all you've got are his sketches.
Yeah.
But it's obvious that he wasn't anti-Semitic. In fact, the girl who's the obvious model, most immediate model for Catherine in A Girl in Winter, the second completed novel, was a Jewish refugee in Oxford, Miriam Plight.
Yeah.
A very early refugee. Her family had made it over in the early 30s, so she never sort of was right up against it. But if you look at her situation, it obviously feeds into the novel.
Yes, because it's not explicitly stated in A Girl in Winter.
No, he deliberately leaves it out.
Yeah.
Perhaps partly because of Monica, I don't know. Yeah. When he abandoned the Monica novel, he wrote to Patsy Strang, I think, I can't write it because it would be seen as an attack on Monica. And I think he meant that because although they never argued about it after the first few years, and you don't see much of it, he just reflects her racism. In fact, he even uses the word yid in a late letter to her about a Labour Party politician coming to Hull in an election. And he just reflects it back at her. He doesn't do anything. And in fact, he always had Jewish friends. The librarian in Belfast was Jewish. And he was part of a group there which had a lot of Jewish members. And I don't think it would ever have bothered him at all. He was not in the slightest bit anti-Semitic or homophobic even. In fact, he wasn't homophobic at all. Although he wasn't really, I didn't think he got genuine homosexual leanings, but he wasn't homophobic.
How old was he when he was writing New World? How long had he been with Monica at that point?
He met Monica in 46, so he was writing in 47, 48. So it was in immediate response to the relationship.
Yeah.
And he abandoned it finally after it trickled along for a bit in 49, 50. Some of the drafts are dated 49. And he abandoned it in 50 or 51. There's a letter which I quote in my biography to Patsy Strang where he basically says, I can't do it anymore. Yeah. And that's the point when he turns over to poetry. And in one of these peculiar neatnesses of his whole career, January 1950 is when he writes At Grass. So you think, and then he's the poet. After that, he's just the poet. Yeah. And it's a completely different person. You don't have these problematics anymore. Yeah. And the novels would have been fascinating and interesting, but if he'd have carried on with them, they would have involved developing his relationship with Monica in a different way, a closer way, and involved ideology in all kinds of ways, which once he turned over to the poetry, he could simply ignore.
Oh, that's really interesting then. So as being a novelist affects how you live your life.
He always regretted it. He always thought, unlike almost all poets and unlike me, he thought that poetry was a lesser art than the novel, and that the novel was the great literary form, and that had he been able to write a great novel, that it would have been a great achievement. But his poetry he never valued. And I think it's one of these strange things. It's like listening to Mozart, which I was just doing. The facility of it is uncanny. You slightly doze off and listen and you think, God, this is absolutely perfect. It's something in his head, his brain, which was just automatically literary in the poetic sense. So once he hit his vein, he hit his vein in 1943, didn't realise it, then sort of went along hitting it again. Sounds like I'm talking about drug taking. I don't mean that, of course. I mean the vein of poetry, not the vein with the hypodermic. Although that's an interesting comparison. Yes, Mozart. I wonder if he took laudanum or anything. Anyway, but the facility of it is uncanny. Yeah. And it's uncanny in Larkin. And you don't know where it's coming from. It's the same in Shakespeare. There's very few poets have it. I think people like Wordsworth and Tennyson has it. The really great poets all have it. Houseman has it, even though he's not so great, but he's got it. And some poets who've managed to get a long way don't have it. Perhaps I shouldn't name names. I think of Wordsworth, actually. He hasn't got it. It's that kind of musical facility that you, as soon as you hear a few lines, you think, this is absolutely perfect and right. Yeah. And it's uncanny. And I think he'd got that. And interestingly, he sort of somehow subconsciously knew it. He bought, obviously, a whole job lot of 10 or more soft-backed manuscript books, sort of semi-hardback. And that's what he wrote all his poetry in until the 1980s. 1947, I think, or 1948.
And that's all he used, so it's like he predicted.
Yes. And the only time he didn't write in that was when he was writing Bridge for the Living and the poems to Betty, which I think he got a separate notebook to write those in, which got lost and has ended up in America. It's egg on the face of the Larkin Society because we missed it when we cleared the house. And it got sold by Mags to Buffalo, which have got it at the moment. I think they paid 30,000, or they asked 30,000 for it. I don't know how much Buffalo paid.
So it's just a small notebook that didn't look like it was part of the...
Yes, and that is because I think he had a very strict idea in his head. He knew what inspired writing was. When he wrote required writing, he knew that wasn't the same, and that's usually prose. But he knew that Bridge for the Living, which was commissioned, was required writing, and he didn't want to pollute his workbooks by putting it in the workbooks. And once he started on this other workbook, he turned it over the other way around and wrote the poems to Betty, because he had a sudden flair with Betty in 1975. And so he wrote these poems in that as well. I think it was in the little cabinet by his bedside when we missed it, and that was sold off. And fortunately, taking it to the tip, the young chap who had it from the bloke who cleared the house, heard it rattling and picked it out. Otherwise, it would have been lost. So, I mean, I'm so grateful to him. I don't care if he made 30,000. He probably didn't make 30,000. He probably made a lot less. But he's welcome to it. And I don't care that the society has egg on its face. The fact that was rescued, it was our fault we didn't find it. I think I know exactly why, but it's a longish story, and I think I know when it should have been found but wasn't, but that's by the way. So the inspired writing is all in these workbooks, and the fact that he kept them and moved on to the next one and the next one. There's an odd bit where he obviously mislaid one. So number 5 has got a lot of stuff which should be in number 3. Right. And they don't quite go in the right order. So he started another one for a bit. He started another book and then went back when he found the earlier one. So at first it's very confusing. But he went on book 5, 6, 7, 8, and that's where his mature work is. And he works methodically on each poem, and he finishes it within, or pretty well always within the year, sometimes within an hour, within a day. And he likes to do that. He knows what he's doing exactly. It's a one-page poem. He writes a draft. Sometimes he cramps an extra bit of the draft in on the same page because he's written it in a morning or an afternoon. This is Wires is like that. And I think Absences isn't like that. He worked on that for quite a while. But there are one or two other poems like that where he just wrote it straight off, then wrote another draft on the same page or corrected it and wrote little extra bits and then determined that it was going to be on that page and he finished it. Other poems, Wits and Weddings, for instance, he took weeks or months over. But he never did what Lawrence did, or some poets do. He never went back to a poem after he'd finished it. He's a real lyricist. It's the moment, and the moment might be kept alive for 4 months or for 7 months or for a year. But he's not going to go back, like Lawrence did, to a poem he'd written 7 years earlier or 10 years earlier and try and write a better version. He never does that, ever. And that's why, if you do know his poetry, people used to say he'd got no development. But it develops absolutely organically along the trajectory of his life.
But if you took one word or phrase out, the whole poem would unravel, wouldn't it? With Larkin?
Exactly. You've got it. Yes, that's exactly right. That's it. And he knew when it was right. And his career goes up. There's the hard buds of the brilliant less deceived poems with a few opening out versions just coming in, fresh flowers and whatever. And then there's one or two of those spill over into the Wits and Weddings. The Wits and Weddings is when he opens out as he's most sociable and open, and that's when the roses are coming into full bloom, as it were. And then there's High Windows when everything's going slightly wrong and the colours of autumn are coming in and the flowers are drooping, but they still look beautiful and interesting and so on. And it's so organic. And it all comes to the moment of the zenith is October 1961 when he wrote Here. And he knew when he'd done that everything after that was downhill. And the next really significant poem is Friday Night in the Royal Station Hotel, which is late. It's got late written all over it in inverted commas.
Yeah.
And he spent a few years writing imitative poems about other poems, poems about pictures, card players, things like that.
Yeah.
Poems based on French poems, Sympathy in White Major, strange, interesting, fascinating poems. Sad Steph's and High Windows, I suppose, the ones which are the most personal at that time. And then, in 1971, he started the building.
Oh, yeah.
And then he hits his late theme. His early theme is the marriage debate, love. He's a total lyric poet. He writes about love, and then he has a bit in the middle where he's not quite sure what he's doing, so he writes a really interesting poem, and then he writes about death. And those two things, and when you look at a poem, you think the building, The Old Fools. The Old Fools is one of the greatest poems about death. It's the most original poems about death. No one else could possibly have written it.
No.
It's such a shocking poem, and yet it says so much that most people have thought. And then, of course, O Bard, which isn't even in High Windows. It spills over into that. And then for the last 7 years of his life, more or less, he just managed to squeeze out the odd little bit. But it's so sad. And he knew it had gone.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why he felt reluctant about taking the laureateship, I think, because he knew that he wasn't a poet anymore, and he couldn't pretend he was. It's very moving.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm getting moved.
I back when I was teaching, I read The Old Fool. I think, do you know that animation?
Yes.
The animation of The Old Fool.
It's good, isn't it?
Beautiful.
Yes.
And I showed it to an A-level class. We weren't studying Larkin. It was just, I wanted them to see it. And their jaws dropped.
Yes.
Yes, it makes me emotional thinking about that.
It's weird how it can be so offensive, and yet the poem itself just doesn't offend.
Yeah.
You know, it's because very few poets could risk that.
Yeah.
Amos would have just made a complete balls up of it. He would have actually seemed to be delighting in the fact that he wasn't himself yet dead. Yeah. Larkin is delighting in the fact that he isn't himself yet dying, you know.
Yeah.
But he knows he's going to, and he puts it into the poem, and he knows that this is what we're all going to come to, and he gets us, everyone who reads it can read themselves into it.
Oh, it's terrifying. That image of the hill ahead of you. How
does
it go? But you're now on it.
Extinction's Alp.
Yeah. Yeah.
And very interestingly, this doesn't fit into our theme at all, but very interestingly, he got that image from Betjeman.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Betjeman is a really interesting poet. A lot of his poetry, it's difficult to get along with, and whatever. Some of it is marvellous. And he's a minor poet compared with Larkin, but there are a few poems about death which have no religion in them at all. Usually he's painful because he's so religious. Yeah. And so he feels he's got to put the religion in. Occasionally he's a bit offensive with it. It seems to imply that if you're not an Anglican, you must be some kind of wicked person, which is just not on for a poet. Yeah. But then there are a few poems simply directly about death, where he leaves all that on one side. And Larkin got one or two of them. I put it in my essay on Betjeman that I gave it as a talk to the Betjeman Society. It's in the Betjeman Society magazine and about Larkin as well. Yeah. And Extinction's Alp, climbing up and looking back and not being able to see where you've got to, and the air becoming thinner. These images are all in the Betjeman poem, right. Which is fascinating. You wouldn't think that the influence would go that way around, but it does. It's like influence is the wrong way around. You know, Larkin's poem about naturally the foundation will bear your expenses, which a lot of piffle has been written about. He's obviously envious of this man. He's not, and even if he thinks he's a bit shallow, it's not a satire on academe, or only on a very shallow level. Yeah. That influenced Auden. Auden's great poem on the circuit was written after he'd read Larkin's poem. Yeah. And everyone thinks that Auden is the great poet of that kind of thing, being on the circuit and giving talks. Because, of course, Larkin didn't do it. Yeah, of course, But Larkin wrote the poem first. Yeah. Interestingly.
It is interesting.
Why aren't they screaming? And, of course, it's what you ask. And you see people in this condition, and it's one of the things that makes it tolerable. What is it? Thin, continuous dreaming.
Yes, It's not the kind of living hell that you might think that we think it is. No. And you can be in your childhood.
Which is why the greatest bit of that poem is somehow oddly consolatory, isn't it? It's oddly, and it's so beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful passages he ever wrote, and you can't imagine any other poet writing, conceiving that, as you say, it's let's just get it that you're still alive and you're still experiencing stuff. It's just that living from day to day in that kind of environment, all you need to know is what happened yesterday or the day before, because you're never going to go anywhere else.
No.
You're looking at the garden. You've only got this very limited number of people around you, the nurses and so on. So why should you remember things that happened 20 years ago? They're much more important and they're much more significant in your own life. But why should you have to know about them? But this has always struck me as absolutely the most original thing that Larkin ever wrote, and one of the most original things in all 20th century poetry. Perhaps being old is having lighted rooms inside your head and people in them acting. People you know, but yet can't quite name. Each looms like a deep loss restored, from known doors turning. Setting down a lamp, smiling from a stair, extracting a known book from the shelves, or sometimes only the rooms themselves, chairs and a fire burning, the blown bush at the window, or the sun's faint friendliness on the wall some lonely rain-ceased midsummer evening. That is where they live, not here and now, but where all happened once. And you think, that's exactly what I've thought at certain times when I've been not quite here, and, a deep loss restored, from known doors returning, from known doors turning, setting down a lamp, smiling from a stair. And you look at the Old Fools, and the place is just down the road. He saw these people in the Old People's Home, just down Beverley Road, just down there, around the corner here. Yeah. And they were visible from the road then. Yeah. They wouldn't be now. No. And you could look across the railings and look at them looking out at the window. In that kind of thing, continuous dreaming. That's where he got it from. Yeah. It was a simple, like a portrait painter, like the woman who painted my portrait. She paints exactly what she sees. The material of the coat looks wrong because it was a very odd coat, but she got exactly the eye to do it, and he had exactly the ear to find the words to say that. But the empty room, of course, leads you back to the early poetry, because that's always an image of his, right from the beginning. He's got this idea of an empty room as somehow being, we'd call it a meme now, wouldn't we?
Yes.
Richard Dawkins has changed our vocabulary forever.
And there we leave James for now. In the final episode with James, he's going to take us through this mysterious world of the empty room in Philip Larkin's poetry, and have a look at Larkin's early writing, in which he's writing in the persona of Brunette Coleman, and is telling us the schoolgirl stories, which are really fascinating. I'd like to thank James for joining us, and Gavin Hogg for his technical support. I'd also just like to say hello to some of our Twitter followers who have sent us some lovely messages, such as Andy Lowe, Lynn Barnsley, Benny Morgan, Tom at Broken Violin, AM Juster, and Susanna Rose 99. It's really, really great to hear from you. It's really nice to see the Twitter community developing. So please follow us at tiny_air, or head over to philiplarkin.com for more information about the Society. You can buy Philip Larkin merchandise there, and even become a Society member. This podcast is produced by Simon Galloway, and the music is The Horns of the Morning by The Mechanicals. Thank you for listening, and if you'd like to be a guest, or if you have any comments, please get in touch.
The horns of the morning are blowing, are shining. The meadow is wet with the coldest of dew.